You're tuning into RX Report, the show where you get your health, your news. I'm Manuel coming to you from the home of pharmacy at the American Pharmacists Association. We've got a very special show for you today, which is why I'm not in my usual chair. Today's big topic is vaccine policy. We are going to get into a lot of it, so be sure to leave us a like and subscribe. Leave a comment on anything and everything that we talk about today, and let's dive in. Last week, two political appointees at the FDA made sweeping changes to U.S. vaccine policy. Without the usual expert panel review, new data, or really any semblance of transparency, that's a pretty complicated topic. So to talk with me about it, I've got Dr. Brigid Groves in the studio today. She is our VP of Professional Affairs here at APHA and has a lot to tell us about these sweeping new changes. Brigid, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mason.
Anytime. It's great to have you back in the studio. I've really just got to kind of get a 10-mile view here of the entire situation. Tell us a little bit about the current situation in the U.S. with these policy changes.
Yeah, as you mentioned in the intro, Mason, we saw last week that two appointees made some changes to COVID vaccine policy. And this week, we saw the HHS secretary make another announcement on vaccine policy. Now, while this was around COVID, it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with COVID.
It's just like vaccine policy in general, not just COVID vaccine policy.
We're setting a precedent here. Okay. So, yes, the changes right now do implicate and pertain to the COVID vaccine, but the precedent is being set that individuals can single-handedly make changes to our vaccine policy and recommendations.
Like without any sort of oversight or basic going through the process. It's just one person says, I want it done this way, and that's how it's done.
And that is seemingly what these individuals have done and displayed this last week and this week.
Seems like a lot of power for one person to mess with the policy for the entire country. Like no checks and balances there. I'm curious, kind of walk us through this step by step. How do changes in this vaccine schedule work under normal circumstances with everything in place?
For many years, the United States has worked with experts who have been scientists, researchers, and experts in the area of vaccines, of infectious disease, and the processes that should be followed to assure that data is evaluated and assuring that we're pulling in new information as it's needed.
Okay, so people like who know what they're talking about, those that are in the field itself.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And those that have dedicated their lives to assuring that safe, efficacious information is available so that they can make recommendations for individuals and patients. So typically the process works by data is generated on a product for a vaccine or a medication through clinical trials or post-marketing surveillance. That data is then evaluated in the case of vaccines through the FDA's VRBPAC committee. I'm going to use a lot of acronyms. Okay. Won't spend time going into detail, but just know that FDA committee looks at the safety information and data and the efficacy, how well that vaccine is working.
Okay, so they're analyzing the data that it's being received from all these different clinical trials and such.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Then that information and recommendation from that subject matter expert panel at the FDA goes on to the FDA commissioner, who will then evaluate and assure that their information's right, and then they issue a license for use of that vaccine.
Okay, so a check on a check on a check, and then finally we get the final send-off of, all right, we can make this vaccine based on all this information we just received.
Yes.
Okay.
So now we have the vaccine that we can safely make and we know is effective. But who can we use it for? Now it moves on to the CDC, where another group of experts look at the information that's, again, available. They look at the data, but they also look at which patients are going to benefit the most from it. Are younger patients, are older, are they patients with certain conditions or diseases that we need to make sure are protected?
Okay.
So that group comes up with the recommendations for what that vaccine should be used for and who it should be best protecting. That recommendation then goes on to the CDC director for them to make that ultimate final recommendation. Yes, we're going to use this vaccine in this patient population.
Okay, so we're just now getting to the point where this vaccine has been approved for a specific subsection of citizens in the country, but that's after the 100 other steps that we just went through. So this isn't a quick process. This sounds kind of painstakingly slow, but necessarily so we get the data we need and the actual research that we need.
And I would say intentionally slow.
Okay.
And at a pace in which is, again, intentionally looking at the information and the data so that we can make an informed and accurate decision. We aren't rushing to a conclusion. We aren't individually thinking, I think this sounds good, I'm going to go with that. No, these are processes that have been tried and true to assure that we are not missing something. We're not inadvertently letting something through. The final step in that process then, though, is How do we get our vaccine out to our patients? So the access and administration by pharmacists or other healthcare providers and clinicians out there. So distribution to the patients out in the communities.
And that's another thing that actually needs to be approved. We can't just decide willy-nilly, okay, pharmacies are going to do it or hospitals are going to do it. Like, it needs to be actually specified within the organization.
Exactly. And who can administer it? At the pharmacy, or is it the pharmacist, or is it a technician, or at the hospital, or at your doctor's office? All of those items, yes.
We just went through the like you said, necessarily painstaking process of getting these vaccines approved, distributed correctly in the ways that they should be. So with the COVID vaccine in particular, where this story is supposedly coming from, but not really. So the COVID vaccine was the progress of the Operation Warp Speed, right? Where this vaccine process was warp speeded into development and then approval, which was shocking, but in a great way. It saved who knows how many lives.
Yes.
So what is your take on that? Like, was that done appropriately? Like, was the effect worth the speed? What do you think?
During the COVID-19 pandemic, we were learning in the moment what we could do, what was going to work. We had opportunities to try new things and to evaluate new processes, but to still follow the tried and true methods that we did. What we saw when putting all hands on deck, focusing on one main goal, putting funds together, was that none of the steps of the process in the production or distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic were skipped. They were done sequentially, and they were done in a shorter timeline because we had the people, the personnel. They were working 24/7. Money to put into that to assure that no steps were skipped, that safety and efficacy data were still available, and that we could get it out to the American public as quickly as we possibly could.
So nothing in this process was skipped, but you're saying that with the appropriate resources and manpower allocation to get it done, we were able to do it that quickly, just as safe as we would over a number of years like we usually do.
Exactly.
So hearing what you're saying about each one of these steps being placed where it needs to be specifically for that reason, it sounds like there's a bit of a fear that by setting this precedent of overall skipping that process, that the schedule can really change without the well-established and objective and peer-reviewed scientific literature that's really a foundation for this kind of development.
Yeah, we're very concerned that this sets an undue precedent that would potentially apply to other vaccines and or other processes, medications, or things even beyond a vaccine. By individuals circumventing the well-established and evidence-based processes that generate the quality information to help us make decisions, we assure that we're not putting something bad through the system or something that could have been good isn't getting through. Doing this in a piecemeal, individual, single-handed approach is dangerous and doesn't allow us to put those checks and balances into place that we need to make sure that the safe and efficacious medications and vaccines are getting out to our patients.
So you use the word dangerous, which that sounds like a very big red flag from somebody like you who comes from the knowledge source that you do. So can you kind of walk us through some of these dangers like that this precedent could pose for pharmacists and patients? I mean, it's going to affect both, right? I mean, if these are getting out without the actual processes needed to ensure their safety.
Sure. What we see potentially coming down the pipeline, especially if this applies to other vaccines or even with the current situation that we're talking about, there's a lack of insurance coverage because if a product or a vaccine isn't on a recommended list, many of our insurances won't cover it. Then it's a high cost, and for a patient that is either low income or doesn't have access based on their own insurance, they might not have the ability to pay for that out of pocket.
Okay.
We also have concerns that for pharmacy in particular and for other healthcare provider types, if they're administering a vaccine that's typically listed on the ACIP recommended schedule, but now has single-handedly been eliminated without a proper evaluation, those pharmacists and pharmacy personnel are not authorized to administer it if it's listed on that schedule and no longer is based upon their state scope of practice.
And it's happening, it seems like in a blink of an eye, just due to one or two people's preferences. So then that kind of leaves the pharmacists out in the lurch where it might have been approved one day and now it seems like it's not.
Exactly, Mason. The confusion that this is creating out there for the American public, for pharmacists, for other healthcare clinicians is rampant. No one knows what they should be getting or what they shouldn't be getting, and no one knows where the source of truth is. The confusion and the distrust that we are creating by doing this piecemeal approach is not helping us to protect anyone.
So can you describe the changes to vaccine policy that have happened in the past, like the way it was done, And is this common? Is this how it's supposed to be? Or is the way that we're doing it now, is that how it's supposed to be?
Great question. The scientific process is to make sure when new information, evidence, and data becomes available, that those scientists and researchers take that into consideration. So annually, we look at vaccine coverage data and the response rate. And we, as the ACIP, as the FDA, as the CDC, as all these individual experts and subject matter experts who have dedicated their careers to this, are evaluating that and making a change in recommendation. So yes, this is a process by which we want to follow, but changes have been made as new information becomes available.
So you're not against change for the process overall. You just want it to be a collaborative change, not just a couple of people changing it because they want to.
Exactly. We have processes in place. We have different groups that look at safety, that look at efficacy, that look at how they're going to get it out to their patients, that look at does it need to be refrigerated or not, or frozen. All of these different groups have a role to play, and it's imperative that each person or each group in that process plays that role instead of one or two individuals single-handedly making a seemingly on-the-whim change.
Brigid, you're the Vice President of Professional Affairs here at APHA, which we stated earlier, and you've been really involved with what work we've been doing both for advocacy, but also for putting these vaccine policies in place and implementing them. So can you tell me and the audience really about some of the work in the vaccine space that APHA and you have been doing over the last few years?
That's a great question, and it's honestly a little bit difficult to start answering that because APHA has been doing so much in the vaccine space for over 20 years. We started by offering a vaccine administration training program for pharmacists and expanded to pharmacy personnel, so including our technicians. More recently, APHA has been invited to weigh in and review the ACIP adult immunization schedule and put its mark of approval on it.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, we've had subject matter experts on many of the different work groups and committees that I highlighted through the review process. And I don't want to highlight the fact that APHA is there. We are there, but what is more important is that these individuals have the knowledge, expertise, and training to critically evaluate the evidence and the data and to come up with an appropriate recommendation on who should use it, when they should use it, or if we need to remove it.
And they're brought into the conversation where hopefully our voices and pharmacists' voices are heard in kind of guiding that process.
Exactly. From a patient standpoint, APHA has crafted some maps that are available on vaccineconfident.pharmacist.com, and that helps patients to identify locations nearby that have pharmacists and pharmacy technicians who could administer the vaccines for them, as well as working closely with their other healthcare provider types, local health departments, public health, to make sure that patients who need and want their vaccines as their best defense against infectious diseases have access to them.
Okay, so we're at APHA basically advocating for making these processes be put in place, making sure that the right voices are heard in the room, and then making sure that the actual product, the actual development of the vaccines, gets to where it needs to go, which is pharmacists to patients.
Exactly.
Beautiful. All right, I love it when a plan comes together. Dr. Brigid Groves, thank you again so much for being in the show. It is always an absolute pleasure having you here in the studio, and I can't wait to have you on the next time. But until then, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Mason. Appreciate it.
And if this podcast made you want to talk to Dr. Brigid Groves about all things vaccine policy, maybe leave us a like and subscribe. What did you think about what we spoke on for vaccine policy? I would love to hear your thoughts in those comments down below. Our executive producer is Rob Hodges. Our creative producer and co-editor is Kate Erdmann. Until next time, I've been your host, Mason Manuel. Be sure to tune in next Friday for more RX Report, where you get your health, your news delivered. But till then, bye y'all.